Part 3, Chapter 4 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga. The Man of Property by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 4 Voyage into the Inferno. The morning after a certain night, on which Soames at last asserted his rights and acted like a man, he breakfasted alone. He breakfasted by gaslight, the fog of late November wrapping the town as in some monstrous blanket, till the trees of the square even were barely visible from the dining-room window. He ate steadily, but at times a sensation as though he could not swallow attacked him. Had he been right to yield to his overmastering hunger of the night before, and break down the resistance which he had suffered now too long from this woman who was his lawful and solemnly constituted helpmate? He was strangely haunted by the recollection of her face, from before which, to soothe her, he had tried to pull her hands, of her terrible smothered sobbing, the like of which he had never heard, and still seemed to hear, and he was still haunted by the odd, intolerable feeling of remorse and shame he had felt, as he stood looking at her by the flame of the single candle, before silently slinking away. And somehow, now that he had acted like this, he was surprised at himself. 2 nights before, at Winifred Dartie's, he had taken Mrs. MacAnder in to dinner. She had said to him, looking in his face with her sharp greenish eyes, "And so your wife is a great friend of that Mr. Bosinney's." Not deigning to ask what she meant, he had brooded over her words. They had aroused in him a fierce jealousy, which, with the peculiar perversion of this instinct, had turned to fiercer desire. Without the incentive of Mrs. MacAnder's words, he might never have done what he had done; without their incentive, and the accident of finding his wife's door for once unlocked, which had enabled him to steal upon her asleep. Slumber had removed his doubts, but the morning brought them again. One thought comforted him: no one would know. It was not the sort of thing that she would speak about. And indeed, when the vehicle of his daily business life, which needed so imperatively the grease of clear and practical thought, started rolling once more with the reading of his letters, those nightmare-like doubts began to assume less extravagant importance at the back of his mind. The incident was really not of great moment. Women made a fuss about it in books, but in the cool judgment of right-thinking men, of men of the world, of such as he recollected often received praise in the divorce court, he had but done his best to sustain the sanctity of marriage, to prevent her from abandoning her duty, possibly, if she was still seeing Bosinney, from... No, he did not regret it. Now that the first step towards reconciliation had been taken, the rest would be comparatively... He rose and walked to the window. His nerve had been shaken. The sound of smothered sobbing was in his ears again. He could not get rid of it. He put on his fur coat and went out into the fog. Having to go into the city, he took the Underground Railway from Sloane Square station. In the corner of the first-class compartment, filled with city men, the smothered sobbing still haunted him. So he opened the Times with the rich crackle that drowns all lesser sounds, and barricaded behind it, set himself steadily to con the news. He read that a recorder had charged a grand jury on the previous day with a more than usually long list of offences. He read of 3 murders, 5 manslaughters, 7 arsons, and as many as 11 rapes, a surprisingly high number, in addition to many less conspicuous crimes to be tried during the coming sessions. And from one piece of news he went on to another, keeping the paper well before his face. And still, inseparable from his reading, was the memory of Irene's tear-stained face, and the sounds from her broken heart. The day was a busy one. including, in addition to the ordinary affairs of his practice, a visit to his brokers, Messrs. Grin and Grinning, to give them instructions to sell his shares in the new Colliery Company Limited, whose business he suspected, rather than knew, was stagnating. This enterprise afterwards slowly declined, and was ultimately sold for a song to an American syndicate. And a long conference at Waterbuck, Q.C.'s chambers, attended by Bolter, by Fiske, the junior counsel, and Waterbuck, Q.C. himself. The case of Forsyte versus Bosinney was expected to be reached on the morrow, before Mr. Justice Bentham. Mr. Justice Bentham, a man of common sense rather than too great legal knowledge, was considered to be about the best man they could have to try the action. He was a strong judge. Waterbuck, Q.C., in pleasing conjunction with an almost rude neglect of Bolter and Fiske, paid to Soames a good deal of attention, by instinct or the sounder evidence of rumour, feeling him to be a man of property. He held with remarkable consistency to the opinion he had already expressed in writing, that the issue would depend to a great extent on the evidence given at the trial, and in a few well-directed remarks he advised Soames not to be too careful in giving that evidence. "A little bluffness, Mr. Forsyte," he said, "a little bluffness." And after he had spoken he laughed firmly, closed his lips tight, and scratched his head just below where he had pushed his wig back, for all the world like the gentleman farmer for whom he loved to be taken. He was considered perhaps the leading man in breach of promise cases. Soames used the Underground again in going home. The fog was worse than ever at Sloane Square station. Through the still, thick blur men groped in and out. Women, very few, grasped their reticules to their bosoms and handkerchiefs to their mouths, crowned with the weird excrescence of the driver, haloed by a vague glow of lamplight that seemed to drown in vapour before it reached the pavement. Cabs loomed, dim-shaped, ever and again, and discharged citizens, bolting like rabbits to their burrows. And these shadowy figures, wrapped each in his own little shroud of fog, took no notice of each other. In the great warren, each rabbit for himself, especially those clothed in the more expensive fur, who, afraid of carriages on foggy days, are driven underground. One figure, however, not far from Soames, waited at the station door. Some buccaneer or lover, of whom each Forsyte thought, "Poor devil, looks as if he were having a bad time." Their kind hearts beat a stroke faster for that poor, waiting, anxious lover in the fog, but they hurried by, well knowing that they had neither time nor money to spare for any suffering but their own. Only a policeman, patrolling slowly and at intervals, took an interest in that waiting figure, the brim of whose slouch hat half hid a face reddened by the cold, all thin and haggard, over which a hand stole now and again to smooth away anxiety or renew the resolution that kept him waiting there. But the waiting lover, if lover he were, was used to policemen's scrutiny, or too absorbed in his anxiety, for he never flinched. A hardened case, accustomed to long trysts, to anxiety and fog and cold, if only his mistress came at last. Foolish lover, fogs last until the spring. There is also snow and rain, no comfort anywhere, gnawing fear if you bring her out, gnawing fear if you bid her stay at home. Serve him right, he should arrange his affairs better. So any respectable Forsyte. Yet if that sounder citizen could have listened at the waiting lover's heart out there in the fog and cold, he would have said again, "Yes, poor devil, he's having a bad time." Soames got into his cab, and with the glass down crept along Sloane Street, and so along the Brompton Road and home. He reached his house at 5. His wife was not in. She had gone out a quarter of an hour before. Out at such a time of night, into this terrible fog? What was the meaning of that? He sat by the dining-room fire, with the door open, disturbed to the soul, trying to read the evening paper. A book was no good. In daily papers alone was any narcotic to such worry as his. From the customary events recorded in the journal he drew some comfort. Suicide of an actress, grave indisposition of a statesman, that chronic sufferer, divorce of an army officer, fire in a colliery. He read them all. They helped him a little, prescribed by the greatest of all doctors, our natural taste. It was nearly 7 when he heard her come in. The incident of the night before had long lost its importance under stress of anxiety at her strange sortie into the fog. But now that Irene was home, the memory of her broken-hearted sobbing came back to him, and he felt nervous at the thought of facing her. She was already on the stairs. Her grey fur coat hung to her knees, its high collar almost hid her face. She wore a thick veil. She neither turned to look at him nor spoke. No ghost or stranger could have passed more silently. Bilson came to lay dinner, and told him that Mrs. Forsyte was not coming down. She was having the soup in her room. For once Soames did not change. It was perhaps the first time in his life that he had sat down to dinner with soiled cuffs, and, not even noticing them, he brooded long over his wine. He sent Bilson to light a fire in his picture room, and presently went up there himself. Turning on the gas, he heaved a deep sigh, as though among these treasures, the backs of which confronted him in stacks around the little room, he found at length his peace of mind. He went straight up to the greatest treasure of them all, an undoubted Turner, and carrying it to the easel, turned its face to the light. There had been a movement in Turners, but he had not been able to make up his mind to part with it. He stood for a long time, his pale, clean-shaven face poked forward above his stand-up collar, looking at the picture as though he were adding it up. A wistful expression came into his eyes. He found, perhaps, that it came to too little. He took it down from the easel to put it back against the wall, but in crossing the room stopped, for he seemed to hear sobbing. It was nothing, only the sort of thing that had been bothering him in the morning, and soon after, putting the high guard before the blazing fire, he stole downstairs. Fresh for the morrow, was his thought. It was long before he went to sleep. It is now to George Forsyte that the mind must turn for light on the events of that fog-engulfed afternoon. The wittiest and most sportsmanlike of the Forsytes had passed the day reading a novel in the paternal mansion at Prince's Gardens. Since a recent crisis in his financial affairs, he had been kept on parole by Roger, and compelled to reside at home. Towards 5 o'clock he went out, and took a train at South Kensington Station, for everyone to-day went underground. His intention was to dine, and pass the evening playing billiards at the Red Pottle, that unique hostel, neither club, hotel, nor good gilt restaurant. He got out at Charing Cross, choosing it in preference to his more usual St. James's Park, that he might reach Jermyn Street by better lighted ways. On the platform his eyes, for in combination with a composed and fashionable appearance George had sharp eyes, and was always on the look-out for Phillips to his sardonic humour, his eyes were attracted by a man who, leaping from a first-class compartment, staggered rather than walked towards the exit. "So ho, my bird," said George to himself. "Why, it's the Buccaneer!" And he put his big figure on the trail. Nothing afforded him greater amusement than a drunken man. Bosinney, who wore a slouch hat, stopped in front of him, spun round, and rushed back towards the carriage he had just left. He was too late. A porter caught him by the coat. The train was already moving on. George's practised glance caught sight of the face of a lady, clad in a grey fur coat, at the carriage window. It was Mrs. Soames, and George felt that this was interesting. And now he followed Bosinney more closely than ever, up the stairs past the ticket collector into the street. In that progress, however, his feelings underwent a change. No longer merely curious and amused, he felt sorry for the poor fellow he was shadowing. The Buccaneer was not drunk, but seemed to be acting under the stress of violent emotion. He was talking to himself, and all that George could catch were the words, "Oh God!" Nor did he appear to know what he was doing or where he was going, but stared, hesitated, moved like a man out of his mind, and from being merely a joker in search of amusement, George felt that he must see the poor chap through. He had "taken the knock," taken the knock. And he wondered what on earth Mrs. Soames had been saying, what on earth she had been telling him in the railway carriage. She had looked bad enough herself. It made George sorry to think of her travelling on with her trouble all alone. He followed close behind Bosinney's elbow, a tall burly figure, saying nothing, dodging warily, and shadowed him out into the fog. There was something here beyond a jest. He kept his head admirably, in spite of some excitement, for in addition to compassion, the instincts of the chase were aroused within him. Bosinney walked right out into the thoroughfare, a vast muffled blackness, where a man could not see 6 paces before him, where, all around, voices or whistles mocked the sense of direction, and sudden shapes came rolling slow upon them, and now and then a light showed like a dim island in an infinite dark sea. And fast into this perilous gulf of night walked Bosinney, and fast after him walked George. If the fellow meant to put his tuppenny under a bus, he would stop it if he could. Across the street and back the hunted creature strode, not groping as other men were groping in that gloom, but driven forward, as though the faithful George behind willed it a knout, and this chase after a haunted man began to have for George the strangest fascination. But it was now that the affair developed in a way which ever afterwards caused it to remain green in his mind. Brought to a standstill in the fog, he heard words which threw a sudden light on these proceedings. What Mrs. Soames had said to Bosinney in the train was now no longer dark. George understood from those mutterings that Soames had exercised his rights over an estranged and unwilling wife in the greatest, the supreme act of property. His fancy wandered in the fields of this situation. It impressed him. He guessed something of the anguish, the sexual confusion and horror in Bosinney's heart, and he thought, yes, it's a bit thick. I don't wonder the poor fellow's half cracked. He had run his quarry to earth on a bench under one of the lions in Trafalgar Square, a monster sphinx astray like themselves in that gulf of darkness. Here, rigid and silent, sat Bosinney, and George, in whose patience was a touch of strange brotherliness, took his stand behind. He was not lacking in a certain delicacy, a sense of form, that did not permit him to intrude upon this tragedy, and he waited, quiet as the lion above, his fur collar hitched above his ears, concealing the fleshy redness of his cheeks, concealing all but his eyes with their sardonic, compassionate stare. And men kept passing back from business on the way to their clubs, men whose figures, shrouded in cocoons of fog, came into view like spectres, and like spectres vanished. Then, even in his compassion, George's quilpish humour broke forth in a sudden longing to pluck these spectres by the sleeve and say, "Here, you Johnnies, you don't often see a show like this. Here's a poor devil whose mistress has just been telling him a pretty little story of her husband. Walk up, he's taken the knock, you see." In fancy he saw them gaping round the tortured lover, and grinned as he thought of some respectable, newly married spectre, enabled by the state of his own affections to catch an inkling of what was going on within Bosinney. He fancied he could see his mouth getting wider and wider, and the fog going down and down, for in George was all that contempt of the married middle class peculiar to the wild and sportsmanlike spirits in its ranks. But he began to be bored. Waiting was not what he had bargained for. After all, he thought, the poor chap will get over it. It's not the first time such a thing has happened in this little city. But now his quarry again began muttering words of violent hate and anger, and following a sudden impulse, George touched him on the shoulder. Bosinney spun round. "Who are you? What do you want?" George could have stood it well enough in the light of the gas lamps, in the light of that everyday world of which he was so hardy a connoisseur. But in this fog, where all was gloomy and unreal, where nothing had that matter-of-fact value associated by Forsytes with earth, he was a victim to strange qualms, and as he tried to stare back into the eyes of this maniac, he thought, "If I see a bobby, I'll hand him over. He's not fit to be at large." But, waiting for no answer, Bosinney strode off into the fog, and George followed, keeping perhaps a little further off, yet more than ever set on tracking him down. "He can't go on like this," he thought. "It's God's own miracle he's not been run over already." He brooded no more on policemen, the sportsman's sacred fire alive again within him. Into a denser gloom than ever Bosinney held at a furious pace, but his pursuer perceived more method in his madness. He was clearly making his way westwards. "He's really going for Soames," thought George. The idea was attractive. It would be a sporting end to such a chase. He had always disliked his cousin. The shaft of a passing cab brushed against his shoulder and made him leap aside. He did not intend to be killed for the Buccaneer, or anyone. Yet, with hereditary tenacity, he stuck to the trail through vapour that blotted out everything but the shadow of the hunted man and the dim moon of the nearest lamp. Then, suddenly, with the instinct of a town stroller, George knew himself to be in Piccadilly. Here he could find his way blindfold, and freed from the strain of geographical uncertainty, his mind returned to Bosinney's trouble. Down the long avenue of his man-about-town experience, bursting, as it were, through a smirch of doubtful amours, there stalked to him a memory of his youth, a memory, poignant still, that brought the scent of hay, the gleam of moonlight, a summer magic into the reek and blackness of this London fog. The memory of a night when, in the darkest shadows of a lawn, he had overheard from a woman's lips that he was not her sole possessor. And for a moment George walked no longer in black Piccadilly, but lay again with hell in his heart and his face to the sweet-smelling dewy grass in the long shadow of poplars that hid the moon. A longing seized him to throw his arm round the Buccaneer and say, "Come on, old boy, time cures all, let's go and drink it off." But a voice yelled at him, and he started back. A cab rolled out of blackness, and into blackness disappeared, and suddenly George perceived that he had lost Bosinney. He ran forward and back, felt his heart clutched by a sickening fear, the dark fear which lives in the wings of the fog. Perspiration started out on his brow. He stood quite still, listening with all his might. And then, as he confided to Dartie the same evening, in the course of a game of billiards at the Red Bottle, I lost him. Dartie twirled complacently at his dark moustache. He had just put together a neat break of 23, failing at Jenny. And who was she? He asked. George looked slowly at the man of the world's fattish, sallow face, and a little grim smile lurked about the curves of his cheeks and his heavy-lidded eyes. "No, no, my fine fellow," he thought, "I'm not going to tell you." For though he mixed with Dartie a good deal, he thought him a bit of a cad. "Oh, some love lady or other," he said, and chalked his cue. "A love lady!" exclaimed Dartie. He used a more figurative expression. "I made sure it was our friend So—" "Did you?" said George curtly. "Then, damme, you've made an error." He missed his shot. He was careful not to allude to the subject again, till towards 11 o'clock, having, in his poetic phraseology, looked upon the drink when it was yellow, he drew aside the blind and gazed out into the street. The murky blackness of the fog was but faintly broken by the lamps of the Red Bottle, and no shape of mortal man or thing was in sight. "I can't help thinking of that poor Buccaneer," he said. "He may be wandering out there now in that fog, if he's not a corpse," he added, with strange dejection. "Corpse?" said Dartie, in whom the recollection of his defeat at Richmond flared up. "He's all right, 10-1, if he wasn't tight." George turned on him, looking really formidable, with a sort of savage gloom on his big face. "Dry up," he said. "Don't I tell you he's taken the knock?"
End of Part 3, Chapter 4. Part 3, Chapter 5 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga. The Man of Property by John Galsworthy.
Part 3, Chapter 5. The Trial. In the morning of his case, which was second on the list, Soames was again obliged to start without seeing Irene, and it was just as well, for he had not as yet made up his mind what attitude to adopt towards her. He had been requested to be in court by 10:30, to provide against the event of the first action, a breach of promise, collapsing, which, however, it did not, both sides showing a courage that afforded Waterbuck, Q.C., an opportunity for improving his already great reputation in this class of case. He was opposed by Ram, the other celebrated breach of promise man. It was a battle of giants. The court delivered judgment just before the luncheon interval. The jury left the box for good, and Soames went out to get something to eat. He met James standing at the little luncheon bar, like a pelican in the wilderness of the galleries, bent over a sandwich with a glass of sherry before him. The spacious emptiness of the great central hall, over which father and son brooded as they stood together, was marred now and then, for a fleeting moment, by barristers in wig and gown hurriedly bolting across, by an occasional old lady or rusty-coated man looking up in a frightened way, and by two persons, bolder than their generation, seated in an embrasure arguing. The sound of their voices arose, together with a scent as of neglected wells, which, mingling with the odour of the galleries, combined to form the savour, like nothing but the emanation of a refined cheese, so indissolubly connected with the administration of British justice. It was not long before James addressed his son. "When's your case coming on? I suppose it'll be on directly. I shouldn't wonder if this Bosinney'd say anything. I should think he'd have to. He'll go bankrupt if it goes against him." He took a large bite at his sandwich and a mouthful of sherry. "Your mother," he said, "wants you and Irene to come and dine tonight." A chill smile played round Soames's lips. He looked back at his father. Anyone who had seen the look, cold and furtive, thus interchanged, might have been pardoned for not appreciating the real understanding between them. James finished his sherry at a draught. "How much?" he asked. On returning to the court, Soames took at once his rightful seat on the front bench beside his solicitor. He ascertained where his father was seated with a glance so sidelong as to commit nobody. James, sitting back with his hands clasped over the handle of his umbrella, was brooding on the end of the bench immediately behind counsel, whence he could get away at once when the case was over. He considered Bosinney's conduct in every way outrageous, but he did not wish to run up against him, feeling that the meeting would be awkward. Next to the divorce court, this court was perhaps the favourite emporium of justice, libel, breach of promise, and other commercial actions being frequently decided there. Quite a sprinkling of persons unconnected with the law occupied the back benches, and the hat of a woman or two could be seen in the gallery. The two rows of seats immediately in front of James were gradually filled by barristers in wigs, who sat down to make pencil notes, chat, and attend to their teeth. But his interest was soon diverted from these lesser lights of justice by the entrance of Waterbuck, Q.C., with the wings of his silk gown rustling, and his red, capable face supported by two short brown whiskers. The famous Q.C. looked, as James freely admitted, the very picture of a man who could heckle a witness. For all his experience, it so happened that he had never seen Waterbuck, Q.C. before, and like many Forsytes in the lower branch of the profession, he had an extreme admiration for a good cross-examiner. The long, lugubrious folds in his cheeks relaxed somewhat after seeing him, especially as he now perceived that Soames alone was represented by silk. Waterbuck, Q.C., had barely screwed round on his elbow to chat with his junior before Mr. Justice Bentham himself appeared, a thin, rather hen-like man with a little stoop, clean-shaven under his snowy wig. Like all the rest of the court, Waterbuck rose and remained on his feet until the judge was seated. James rose, but slightly. He was already comfortable, and had no opinion of Bentham, having sat next but one to him at dinner twice at the Bumley Tom's. Bumley Tom was rather a poor thing, though he had been so successful. James himself had given him his first brief. He was excited too, for he had found out that Bosinney was not in court. "Now, what does he mean by that?" he kept on thinking. The case having been called on, Waterbuck, Q.C., pushing back his papers, hitched his gown on his shoulder, and with a semicircular look around him, like a man who is going to bat, arose and addressed the court. The facts, he said, were not in dispute, and all that his lordship would be asked was to interpret the correspondence which had taken place between his client and the defendant, an architect, with reference to the decoration of a house. He would, however, submit that this correspondence could only mean one very plain thing. After briefly reciting the history of the house at Robin Hill, which he described as a mansion, and the actual facts of expenditure, he went on as follows. My client, Mr. Soames Forsyte, is a gentleman, a man of property, who would be the last to dispute any legitimate claim that might be made against him, but he has met with such treatment from his architect in the matter of this house, over which he has, as your lordship has heard, already spent some £12,000, a sum considerably in advance of the amount he had originally contemplated, that as a matter of principle, and this I cannot too strongly emphasize, as a matter of principle, and in the interests of others, he has felt himself compelled to bring this action. The point put forward in defence by the architect, I will suggest to your lordship, is not worthy of a moment's serious consideration." He then read the correspondence. His client, a man of recognised position, was prepared to go into the box, and to swear that he never did authorise, and it was never in his mind to authorise, the expenditure of any money beyond the extreme limit of £12,050, which he had clearly fixed, and not further to waste the time of the court, he would at once call Mr. Forsyte. Soames then went into the box. His whole appearance was striking in its composure. His face, just supercilious enough, pale and clean-shaven, with a little line between the eyes and compressed lips, his dress in unostentatious order, one hand neatly gloved, the other bare. He answered the questions put to him in a somewhat low but distinct voice. His evidence under cross-examination savoured of taciturnity. Had he used the expression "a free hand"? No. Come, come. The expression he had used was "a free hand" in the terms of this correspondence. Would you tell the court that that was English? Yes. What you said means? What it says. Are you prepared to deny that it is a contradiction in terms? Yes. You are not an Irishman? No. Are you a well-educated man? Yes. And yet you persist in that statement? Yes. Throughout this and much more cross-examination, which turned again and again around the nice point, James sat with his hand behind his ear, his eyes fixed upon his son. He was proud of him. He could not but feel that in similar circumstances he himself would have been tempted to enlarge his replies, but his instinct told him that this taciturnity was the very thing. He sighed with relief, however, when Soames, slowly turning and without any change of expression, descended from the box. When it came to the turn of Bosinney's counsel to address the judge, James redoubled his attention, and he searched the court again and again to see if Bosinney were not somewhere concealed. Young Chankery began nervously. He was placed by Bosinney's absence in an awkward position. He therefore did his best to turn that absence to account. He could not but fear, he said, that his client had met with an accident. He had fully expected him there to give evidence. They had sent round that morning, both to Mr. Bosinney's office and to his rooms. Though he knew they were one and the same, he thought it was as well not to say so. But it was not known where he was, and this he considered to be ominous, knowing how anxious Mr. Bosinney had been to give his evidence. He had not, however, been instructed to apply for an adjournment, and in default of such instruction he conceived it his duty to go on. The plea on which he somewhat confidently relied, and which his client, had he not unfortunately been prevented in some way from attending, would have supported by his evidence, was that such an expression as a free hand could not be limited, fettered, and rendered unmeaning by any verbiage which might follow it. He would go further and say that the correspondence showed that whatever he might have said in his evidence, Mr. Forsyte had in fact never contemplated repudiating liability on any of the work ordered or executed by his architect. The defendant had certainly never contemplated such a contingency, or, as was demonstrated by his letters, he would never have proceeded with the work, a work of extreme delicacy, carried on with great care and efficiency, to meet and satisfy the fastidious taste of a connoisseur, a rich man, a man of property. He felt strongly on this point, and feeling strongly, he used perhaps rather strong words when he said that this action was of a most unjustifiable, unexpected, indeed unprecedented character. If his lordship had had the opportunity that he himself had made it his duty to take, to go over this very fine house and see the great delicacy and beauty of the decorations executed by his client, an artist in his most honourable profession, he felt convinced that not for one moment would his lordship tolerate this, he would use no stronger word than daring attempt to evade legitimate responsibility. Taking the text of Soames's letters, he lightly touched on Boileau versus the Blasted Cement Company Limited. It is doubtful, he said, what that authority has decided. In any case, I would submit that it is just as much in my favour as my friend's. He then argued that nice point closely. With all due deference, he submitted that Mr. Forsyte's expression nullified itself. His client not being a rich man, the matter was a serious one for him. He was a very talented architect, whose professional reputation was undoubtedly somewhat at stake. He concluded, with a perhaps too personal appeal to the judge as a lover of the arts, to show himself the protector of artists from what was occasionally, he said occasionally, the too iron hand of capital. What, he said, will be the position of the artistic professions if men of property like this Mr. Forsyte refuse, and are allowed to refuse, to carry out the obligations of the commissions which they have given? He would now call his client in case he should at the last moment have found himself able to be present. The name Philip Bosinney was called 3 times by the ushers, and the sound of the calling echoed with strange melancholy throughout the court and galleries. The crying of this name, to which no answer was returned, had upon James a curious effect. It was like calling for your lost dog about the streets, and the creepy feeling that it gave him, of a man missing, grated on his sense of comfort and security, on his coziness. Though he could not have said why, it made him feel uneasy. He looked now at the clock. 2:45. It would all be over in a quarter of an hour. Where could the young fellow be? It was only when Mr. Justice Bentham delivered judgment that he got over the turn he had received. Behind the wooden erection, by which he was fenced from more ordinary mortals, the learned judge leant forward. The electric light, just turned on above his head, fell on his face, and mellowed it to an orange hue beneath the snowy crown of his wig. The amplitude of his robes grew before the eye. His whole figure, facing the comparative dusk of the court, radiated like some majestic and sacred body. He cleared his throat, took a sip of water, broke the nib of a quill against the desk, and folding his bony hands before him, began. To James he suddenly loomed much larger than he had ever thought Bentham would loom. It was the majesty of the law, and a person endowed with a nature far less matter-of-fact than that of James might have been excused for failing to pierce this halo, and disinter therefrom the somewhat ordinary Forsyte, who walked and talked in everyday life under the name of Sir Walter Bentham. He delivered judgment in the following words. The facts in this case are not in dispute. On May the 15th last, the defendant wrote to the plaintiff, requesting to be allowed to withdraw from his professional position in regard to the decoration of the plaintiff's house, unless he were given a free hand. The plaintiff, on May the 17th, wrote back as follows: In giving you, in accordance with your request, this free hand, I wish you to clearly understand that the total cost of the house, as handed over to me, completely decorated, inclusive of your fee, as arranged between us, must not exceed £12,000. To this letter the defendant replied on May the 18th: "If you think that in such a delicate matter as decoration I can bind myself to the exact pound, I am afraid you are mistaken." On May the 19th the plaintiff wrote as follows: "I did not mean to say that if you should exceed the sum named in my letter to you by £10 or £20 or even £50, there would be any difficulty between us. You have a free hand in the terms of this correspondence, and I hope you will see your way to completing the decorations." On May the 20th the defendant replied thus shortly: "Very well." In completing these decorations the defendant incurred liabilities and expenses which brought the total cost of this house up to the sum of £12,400, all of which expenditure has been defrayed by the plaintiff. This action has been brought by the plaintiff to recover from the defendant the sum of £350, expended by him in excess of a sum of £12,050, alleged by the plaintiff to have been fixed by this correspondence as the maximum sum that the defendant had authority to expend. The question for me to decide is whether or no the defendant is liable to refund to the plaintiff this sum. In my judgment, he is so liable. What in effect the plaintiff has said is this: I give you a free hand to complete these decorations, provided that you keep within a total cost to me of £12,000. If you exceed that sum by as much as £50, I will not hold you responsible. Beyond that point you are no agent of mine, and I shall repudiate liability. It is not clear to me whether, had the plaintiff in fact repudiated liability under his agent's contracts, he would under all the circumstances have been successful in so doing. But he has not adopted this course. He has accepted liability and fallen back upon his rights against the defendant under the terms of the latter's engagement. In my judgment, the plaintiff is entitled to recover this sum from the defendant. It has been sought on behalf of the defendant to show that no limit of expenditure was fixed or intended to be fixed by this correspondence. If this were so, I can find no reason for the plaintiff's importation into the correspondence of the figures of £12,000 and subsequently of £50. The defendant's contention would render these figures meaningless. It is manifest to me that by his letter of May the 20th he ascended to a very clear proposition, by the terms of which he must be held to be bound. For these reasons there will be judgment for the plaintiff for the amount claimed, with costs. James sighed, and stooping, picked up his umbrella, which had fallen with a rattle at the words "importation into this correspondence." Untangling his legs, he rapidly left the court without waiting for his son. He snapped up a hansom cab, it was a clear grey afternoon, and drove straight to Timothy's, where he found Swithin, and to him, Mrs. Septimus Small, and Aunt Hester, he recounted the whole proceedings, eating 2 muffins not altogether at the intervals of speech. "Soames did very well," he ended. "He's got his head screwed on in the right way. This won't please Jolyon. It's a bad business for that young Bosinney. He'll go bankrupt, I shouldn't wonder." And then, after a long pause, during which he had stared disquietly into the fire, he added: "He wasn't there. Now why?" There was a sound of footsteps. The figure of a thick-set man, with the ruddy brown face of robust health, was seen in the back drawing-room. The forefinger of his upraised hand was outlined against the black of his frock coat. He spoke in a grudging voice. "Well, James," he said, I can't stop," and turning round, he walked out. It was Timothy. James rose from his chair. "There," he said, "there. I knew there was something wrong." He checked himself, and was silent, staring before him as though he had seen a portent. End of Part 3, Chapter 5.
Part 3, Chapter 6 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga, The Man of Property, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 6, Soames Breaks the News. In leaving the court, Soames did not go straight home. He felt disinclined for the city, and drawn by need for sympathy in his triumph, he too made his way, but slowly and on foot, to Timothy's in the Bayswater Road. His father had just left. Mrs. Small and Aunt Hester, in possession of the whole story, greeted him warmly. They were sure he was hungry after all that evidence. Smithers should toast him some more muffins. His dear father had eaten them all. He must put his legs up on the sofa, and he must have a glass of prune brandy too. It was so strengthening. Swithin was still present, having lingered later than his wont, for he felt in want of exercise. On hearing this suggestion, he pished. A pretty pass young men were coming to. His own liver was out of order, and he could not bear the thought of anyone else drinking prune brandy. He went away almost immediately, saying to Soames, "And how's your wife? You tell her from me that if she's dull, and likes to come and dine with me quietly, I'll give her such a bottle of champagne as she doesn't get every day." Staring down from his height on Soames, he contracted his thick, puffy, yellow hand, as though squeezing within it all this small fry, and throwing out his chest, he waddled slowly away. Mrs. Small and Aunt Hester were left horrified. Swithin was so droll. They themselves were longing to ask Soames how Irene would take the result, yet knew that they must not. He would perhaps say something of his own accord, to throw some light on this, the present burning question in their lives, the question that from necessity of silence tortured them almost beyond bearing, for even Timothy had now been told, and the effect on his health was little short of alarming. And what, too, would June do? This also was a most exciting, if dangerous, speculation. They had never forgotten Old Jolyon's visit, since when he had not once been to see them. They had never forgotten the feeling it gave all who were present, that the family was no longer what it had been, that the family was breaking up. But Soames gave them no help, sitting with his knees crossed, talking of the Barbizon school of painters whom he had just discovered. These were the coming men, he said. He should not wonder if a lot of money were made over them. He had his eye on 2 pictures by a man called Corot. Charming things. If he could get them at a reasonable price, he was going to buy them. They would, he thought, fetch a big price some day. Interested as they could not but be, neither Mrs. Septimus Small nor Aunt Hester could entirely acquiesce in being thus put off. It was interesting, most interesting, and then Soames was so clever that they were sure he would do something with those pictures if anybody could. But what was his plan now that he had won his case? Was he going to leave London at once and live in the country, or what was he going to do? Soames answered that he did not know. He thought they should be moving soon. He rose and kissed his aunts. No sooner had Aunt Juley received this emblem of departure than a change came over her, as though she were being visited by dreadful courage. Every little roll of flesh on her face seemed trying to escape from an invisible confining mask. She rose to the full extent of her more than medium height, and said, "It has been on my mind a long time, dear, and if nobody else will tell you, I have made up my mind that—" Aunt Hester interrupted her. "Mind, Julia, you do it," she gasped, "on your own responsibility." Mrs. Small went on as though she had not heard. "I think you ought to know, dear, that Mrs. MacAnder saw Irene walking in Richmond Park with Mr. Bosinney." Aunt Hester, who had also risen, sank back in her chair and turned her face away. Really, Julie was too. She should not do such things when she, Aunt Hester, was in the room. And breathless with anticipation, she waited for what Soames would answer. He had flushed the peculiar flush which always centred between his eyes. Lifting his hand, and, as it were, selecting a finger, he bit a nail delicately. Then, drawling it out between set lips, he said, "Mrs. MacAnder is a cat." Without waiting for any reply, he left the room. When he went into Timothy's, he had made up his mind what course to pursue on getting home. He would go up to Irene and say, "Well, I've won my case, and there's an end of it. I don't want to be hard on Bosinney. I'll see if we can't come to some arrangement. He shan't be pressed. And now let's turn over a new leaf. We'll let the house and get out of these fogs. We'll go down to Robin Hill at once. I never meant to be rough with you. Let's shake hands and—" Perhaps she would let him kiss her and forget. When he came out of Timothy's, his intentions were no longer so simple. The smouldering jealousy and suspicion of months blazed up within him. He would put an end to that sort of thing once and for all. He would not have her drag his name in the dirt. If she could not or would not love him, as was her duty and his right, she should not play him tricks with anyone else. He would tax her with it, threaten to divorce her. That would make her behave. She would never face that. But what if she did? He was staggered. This had not occurred to him. What if she did? What if she made him a confession? How would he stand then? He would have to bring a divorce. A divorce. Thus close, the word was paralyzing, so utterly at variance with all the principles that had hitherto guided his life. Its lack of compromise appalled him. He felt like the captain of a ship going to the side of his vessel, and with his own hands throwing over the most precious of his bales. This jettisoning of his property with his own hands seemed uncanny to Soames. It would injure him in his profession. He would have to get rid of the house at Robin Hill, on which he had spent so much money, so much anticipation, and at a sacrifice. And she would no longer belong to him, not even in name. She would pass out of his life, and he should never see her again. He traversed in the cab the length of a street without getting beyond the thought that he should never see her again. But perhaps there was nothing to confess. Even now, very likely, there was nothing to confess. Was it wise to push things so far? Was it wise to put himself into a position where he might have to eat his words? The result of this case would ruin Bosinney. A ruined man was desperate, but what could he do? He might go abroad. Ruined men always went abroad. What could they do, if indeed it was they, without money? It would be better to wait and see how things turned out. If necessary, he could have her watched. The agony of his jealousy, for all the world like the crisis of an aching tooth, came on again, and he almost cried out. But he must decide, fix on some course of action before he got home. When the cab drew up at the door, he had decided nothing. He entered, pale, his hands moist with perspiration, dreading to meet her, burning to meet her, ignorant of what he was to say or do. The maid Bilson was in the hall, and in answer to his question, "Where is your mistress?" told him that Mrs. Forsyte had left the house about noon, taking with her a trunk and a bag. Snatching the sleeve of his fur coat away from her grasp, he confronted her. "What?" he exclaimed. "What's that you said?" Suddenly recollecting that he must not betray emotion, he added, "What message did she leave?" and noticed with secret terror the startled look of the maid's eyes. "Mrs. Forsyte left no message, sir." "No message. Very well, thank you, that will do. I shall be dining out." The maid went downstairs, leaving him still in his fur coat, idly turning over the visiting cards in the porcelain bowl that stood on the carved oak rug chest in the hall. Mr. and Mrs. Bareham Culcher, Mrs. Septimus Small, Mrs. Baines, Mr. Solomon Thornworthy, Lady Bellis, Miss Hermione Bellis, Miss Winifred Bellis, Miss Ella Bellis. Who the devil were all these people? He seemed to have forgotten all familiar things. The words, "no message, a trunk and a bag," played a hide-and-seek in his brain. It was incredible that she had left no message, and still in his fur coat, he ran upstairs, 2 steps at a time, as a young married man when he comes home will run up to his wife's room. Everything was dainty, fresh, sweet-smelling, everything in perfect order. On the great bed with its lilac silk quilt was the bag she had made and embroidered with her own hands to hold her sleeping things. Her slippers ready at the foot, the sheets even turned over at the head as though expecting her. On the table stood the silver-mounted brushes and bottles from her dressing bag, his own present. There must then be some mistake. What bag had she taken? He went to the bell to summon Bilson, but remembered in time that he must assume knowledge of where Irene had gone, take it all as a matter of course, and grope out the meaning for himself. He locked the doors and tried to think, but felt his brain going round, and suddenly tears forced themselves into his eyes. Hurriedly pulling off his coat, he looked at himself in the mirror. He was too pale, a greyish tinge all over his face. He poured out water and began feverishly washing. Her silver-mounted brushes smelt faintly of the perfumed lotion she used for her hair, and at this scent the burning sickness of his jealousy seized him again. Struggling into his fur, he ran downstairs and out into the street. He had not lost all command of himself, however, and as he went down Sloane Street he framed a story for use in case he should not find her at Bosinney's. But if he should, his power of decision again failed. He reached the house without knowing what he should do if he did find her there. It was after office hours, and the street door was closed. The woman who opened it could not say whether Mr. Bosinney were in or no. She had not seen him that day, not for 2 or 3 days. She did not attend to him now, nobody attended to him. Soames interrupted her. He would go up and see for himself. He went up with a dogged, white face. The top floor was unlighted, the door closed, no one answered his ringing, he could hear no sound. He was obliged to descend, shivering under his fur, a chill at his heart. Hailing a cab, he told the man to drive to Park Lane. On the way he tried to recollect when he had last given her a cheque. She could not have more than £3 or £4, but there were her jewels, and with exquisite torture he remembered how much money she could raise on these, enough to take them abroad, enough for them to live on for months. He tried to calculate. The cab stopped, and he got out with the calculation unmade. The butler asked whether Mrs. Soames was in the cab. The master had told him they were both expected to dinner. Soames answered, "No, Mrs. Forsyte has a cold." The butler was sorry. Soames thought he was looking at him inquisitively, and remembering that he was not in dress clothes, asked, "Anybody here to dinner, Warmson?" "Nobody but Mr. and Mrs. Dartie, sir." Again it seemed to Soames that the butler was looking curiously at him. His composure gave way. "What are you looking at?" he said. "What's the matter with me, eh?" The butler blushed, hung up the fur coat, murmured something that sounded like "Nothing, sir, I'm sure, sir," and stealthily withdrew. Soames walked upstairs. Passing the drawing-room without a look, he went straight up to his mother's and father's bedroom. James, standing sideways, the concave lines of his tall, lean figure displayed to advantage in shirt sleeves and evening waistcoat, his head bent, the end of his white tie peeping askew from underneath one white Dundreary whisker, his eyes peering with intense concentration, his lips pouting, was hooking the top hooks of his wife's bodice. Soames stopped. He felt half choked, whether because he had come upstairs too fast, or for some other reason. He himself had never been asked to. He heard his father's voice, as though there was a pen in his mouth, saying, "Who's that? Who's there? What do you want?" His mother's, "Here, Felice, come and hook this, your master'll never get done." He put his hand up to his throat and said hoarsely, "It's I, Soames." He noticed gratefully the affectionate surprise in Emily's, "Well, my dear boy?" and James, as he dropped the hook, "What, Soames? What's brought you up? Aren't you well?" He answered mechanically, "I'm all right," and looked at them, and it seemed impossible to bring out his news. James, quick to take alarm, began, "You don't look well. I expect you've taken a chill. It's liver, I shouldn't wonder. Your mother'll give you—" But Emily broke in quietly, "Have you brought Irene?" Soames shook his head. "No," he stammered. She's left me." Emily deserted the mirror before which she was standing. Her tall, full figure lost its majesty and became very human as she came running over to Soames. "My dear boy, my dear boy." She put her lips to his forehead and stroked his hand. James, too, had turned full towards his son. His face looked older. "Left you?" he said. "What do you mean? Left you? You never told me she was going to leave you." Soames answered surlily, "How could I tell? What's to be done?" James began walking up and down. He looked strange and stork-like without a coat. "What's to be done?" he muttered. "How should I know what's to be done? What's the good of asking me? Nobody tells me anything, and then they come and ask me what's to be done, and I should like to know how I'm to tell them. Here's your mother. There she stands, she doesn't say anything. What I should say you've got to do is to follow her." Soames smiled. His peculiar, supercilious smile had never before looked pitiable. "I don't know where she's gone," he said. "Don't know where she's gone?" said James. "How do you mean, don't know where she's gone? Where do you suppose she's gone? She's gone after that young Bosinney, that's where she's gone. I knew how it would be." Soames, in the long silence that followed, felt his mother pressing his hand, and all that passed seemed to pass as though his own power of thinking or doing had gone to sleep. His father's face, dusky red, twitching as if he were going to cry, and words breaking out that seemed rent from him by some spasm in his soul. "There'll be a scandal, I always said so." Then, no one saying anything, "And there you stand, you and your mother." And Emily's voice, calm, rather contemptuous, "Come now, James, Soames will do all that he can." And James, staring at the floor, a little brokenly, "Well, I can't help you, I'm getting old. Don't you be in too great a hurry, my boy." And his mother's voice again, "Soames will do all he can to get her back. We won't talk of it. It'll all come right, I dare say." And James, "Well, I can't see how it can come right. And if she hasn't gone off with that young Bosinney, my advice to you is not to listen to her, but to follow her and get her back." Once more Soames felt his mother stroking his hand, in token of her approval, and as though repeating some form of sacred oath, he muttered between his teeth, "I will." All three went down to the drawing-room together. There were gathered the three girls and Dartie. Had Irene been present, the family circle would have been complete. James sank into his arm-chair, and except for a word of cold greeting to Dartie, whom he both despised and dreaded, as a man likely to be always in want of money, he said nothing till dinner was announced. Soames, too, was silent. Emily alone, a woman of cool courage, maintained a conversation with Winifred on trivial subjects. She was never more composed in her manner and conversation than that evening. A decision having been come to not to speak of Irene's flight, no view was expressed by any other member of the family as to the right course to be pursued. There can be little doubt, from the general tone adopted in relation to events as they afterwards turned out, that James's advice, "Don't you listen to her, follow her and get her back," would, with here and there an exception, have been regarded as sound, not only in Park Lane, but amongst the Nicholases, the Rogers, and at Timothy's; just as it would surely have been endorsed by that wider body of Forsytes all over London, who were merely excluded from judgment by ignorance of the story. In spite, then, of Emily's efforts, the dinner was served by Warmson and the footman almost in silence. Dartie was sulky, and drank all he could get. The girls seldom talked to each other at any time. James asked once where June was, and what she was doing with herself these days. No one could tell him. He sank back into gloom. Only when Winifred recounted how little Publius had given his bad penny to a beggar did he brighten up. "Ah," he said, "that's a clever little chap. I don't know what'll become of him if he goes on like this. An intelligent little chap, I call him." But it was only a flash. The courses succeeded one another solemnly, under the electric light which glared down onto the table, but barely reached the principal ornament of the walls, a so-called sea-piece by Turner, almost entirely composed of cordage and drowning men. Champagne was handed, and then a bottle of James' prehistoric port, but as by the chill hand of some skeleton. At 10 o'clock Soames left. Twice, in reply to questions, he had said that Irene was not well. He felt he could no longer trust himself. His mother kissed him with her large soft kiss, and he pressed her hand, a flush of warmth in his cheeks. He walked away in the cold wind, which whistled desolately around the corners of the streets, under a sky of clear steel blue, alive with stars. He noticed neither their frosty greeting, nor the crackle of the curled-up plane leaves, nor the night women hurrying in their shabby furs, nor the pinched faces of vagabonds at street corners. Winter was come, but Soames hastened home, oblivious. His hands trembled as he took the late letters from the gilt wire cage into which they had been thrust through the slit in the door. None from Irene. He went into the dining-room. The fire was bright there, his chair drawn up to it, slippers ready, spirit case, and carven cigarette-box on the table. But after staring at it all for a minute or two, he turned out the light and went upstairs. There was a fire, too, in his dressing-room, but her room was dark and cold. It was into this room that Soames went. He made a great illumination with candles, and for a long time continued pacing up and down between the bed and the door. He could not get used to the thought that she had really left him, and as though still searching for some message, some reason, some reading of all the mystery of his married life, he began opening every recess and drawer. There were her dresses. He had always liked, indeed insisted, that she should be well dressed. She had taken very few, 2 or 3 at most, and drawer after drawer, full of linen and silk things, was untouched. Perhaps, after all, it was only a freak, and she had gone to the seaside for a few days' change. If only that were so, and she were really coming back, he would never again do as he had done that fatal night before last, never again run that risk. Though it was her duty as a wife, though she did belong to him, he would never again run that risk. She was evidently not quite right in her head. He stooped over the drawer where she kept her jewels. It was not locked, and came open as he pulled. The jewel box had the key in it. This surprised him until he remembered that it was sure to be empty. He opened it. It was far from empty. Divided, in little green velvet compartments, were all the things he had given her, even her watch, and stuck into the recess that contained the watch was a three-cornered note addressed Soames Forsyte, in Irene's handwriting. "I think I have taken nothing that you or your people have given me." And that was all. He looked at the clasps and bracelets of diamonds and pearls, at the little flat gold watch with a great diamond set in sapphires, at the chains and rings, each in its nest, and the tears rushed up in his eyes and dropped upon them. Nothing that she could have done, nothing that she had done, brought home to him like this the inner significance of her act. For the moment, perhaps, he understood nearly all there was to understand, understood that she loathed him, that she had loathed him for years, that for all intents and purposes they were like people living in different worlds, that there was no hope for him, never had been, even that she had suffered, that she was to be pitied. In that moment of emotion he betrayed the Forsyte in him, forgot himself, his interests, his property, was capable of almost anything, was lifted into the pure ether of the selfless and unpractical. Such moments pass quickly. And, as though with the tears he had purged himself of weakness, he got up, locked the box, and slowly, almost trembling, carried it with him into the other room. End of Part 3, Chapter 6. Recording by Leanne Howlett.
Part 3, Chapter 7. Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. The Forsyte Saga, Man of Property, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 7. June's Victory. June had waited for her chance, scanning the duller columns of the journals, morning and evening, with an acidity which at first puzzled old Jolyon, and when her chance came, she took it with all the promptitude and resolute tenacity of her character. She will always remember best in her life that morning, when at last she saw amongst the reliable cause list of the Times newspaper, under the heading of Court 13, Mr. Justice Bentham, the case of Forsyte versus Bosinney. Like a gambler who stakes his last piece of money, she had prepared to hazard her all upon this throw. It was not her nature to contemplate defeat. How, unless with the instinct of a woman in love, she knew that Bosinney's discomfiture in this action was assured, cannot be told. On this assumption, however, she laid her plans as upon a certainty. 11:30 found her at watch in the gallery of Court 13, and there she remained till the case of Forsyte versus Bosinney was over. Bosinney's absence did not disquiet her. She had felt instinctively that he would not defend himself. At the end of the judgment she hastened down, and took a cab to his rooms. She passed the open street door and the offices on the 3 lower floors, without attracting notice. Not till she reached the top did her difficulties begin. Her ring was not answered. She had now to make up her mind whether she would go down and ask the caretaker in the basement to let her in to await Mr. Bosinney's return, or remain patiently outside the door, trusting that no one would come up. She decided on the latter course. A quarter of an hour had passed in freezing vigil on the landing, before it occurred to her that Bosinney had been used to leave the key of his rooms under the doormat. She looked and found it there. For some minutes she could not decide to make use of it. At last she let herself in and left the door open that anyone who came might see she was there on business. This was not the same June who had paid the trembling visit 5 months ago. Those months of suffering and restraint had made her less sensitive. She had dwelt on this visit so long, with such minuteness, that its terrors were discounted beforehand. She was not there to fail this time, for if she failed no one could help her. Like some mother beast on the watch over her young, her little quick finger never stood still in that room, but wandered from wall to wall, from window to door, fingering now one thing, now another. There was dust everywhere. The room could not have been cleaned for weeks, and June, quick to catch at anything that should buoy up her hope, saw in it a sign that he had been obliged, for economy's sake, to give up his servant. She looked into the bedroom. The bed was roughly made, as though by the hand of man. Listening intently, she darted in, and peered into his cupboards. A few shirts and collars, a pair of muddy boots. The room was bare even of garments. She stole back to the sitting-room, and now she noticed the absence of all the little things he had set store by. The clock that had been his mother's, the field-glasses that had hung over the sofa, 2 really valuable old prints of Harrow, where his father had been at school, and last, not least, the piece of Japanese pottery she herself had given him. All were gone, and in spite of the rage roused within her championed soul, at the thought that the world should treat him thus, their disappearance augured happily for the success of her plan. It was while looking at the spot where the piece of Japanese pottery had stood that she felt a strange certainty of being watched, and turning, saw Irene in the open doorway. The two stood gazing at each other for a minute in silence. Then June walked forward and held out her hand. Irene did not take it. When her hand was refused, June put it behind her. Her eyes grew steady with anger. She waited for Irene to speak, and thus waiting, took in, with who knows what rage of jealousy, suspicion, and curiosity, every detail of her friend's face and dress and figure. Irene was clothed in her long grey fur. The travelling cap on her head left a wave of gold hair visible above her forehead. The soft fullness of the coat made her face as small as a child's. Unlike June's cheeks, her cheeks had no colour in them, but were ivory white and pinched as if with cold. Dark circles lay round her eyes. In one hand she held a bunch of violets. She looked back at June, no smile on her lips, and with those great dark eyes fastened on her. The girl, for all her startled anger, felt something of the old spell. She spoke first, after all. "What have you come for?" But the feeling that she herself was being asked the same question made her add, "This horrible case. I came to tell him he has lost it." Irene did not speak. Her eyes never moved from June's face, and the girl cried, "Don't stand there as if you were made of stone." Irene laughed. "I wish to God I were." But June turned away. "Stop!" she cried. "Don't tell me. I don't want to hear. I don't want to hear what you've come for. I don't want to hear." And like some uneasy spirit, she began swiftly walking to and fro. Suddenly she broke out, "I was here first. We can't both stay here together." On Irene's face a smile wandered up, and died out like a flicker of firelight. She did not move. and then it was that June perceived under the softness and immobility of this figure something desperate and resolved, something not to be turned away, something dangerous. She tore off her hat, and putting both hands to her brow, pressed back the bronze mass of her hair. "You have no right here," she cried defiantly. Irene answered, "I have no right anywhere." "What do you mean?" "I have left Soames. You always wanted me to." June put her hand over her ears. I don't want to hear anything. I don't want to know anything. It's impossible to fight with you. What makes you stand like that? Why don't you go?" Irene's lips moved. She seemed to be saying, "Where should I go?" June turned to the window. She could see the face of a clock down in the street. It was nearly 4. At any moment he might come. She looked back across her shoulder, and her face was distorted with anger. But Irene had not moved. In her gloved hands she ceaselessly turned and twisted the little bunch of violets. The tears of rage and disappointment rolled down June's cheeks. "How could you come?" she said. "You have been a false friend to me." Again Irene laughed. June saw that she had played a wrong card, and broke down. "Why have you come?" she sobbed. "You've ruined my life, and now you want to ruin his." Irene's mouth quivered. Her eyes met June's with a look so mournful that the girl cried out in the midst of her sobbing, "No, no!" But Irene's head bent till it touched her breast. She turned and went quickly out, hiding her lips with the little bunch of violets. June ran to the door. She heard the footsteps going down and down. She called out, "Come back, Irene! Come back!" The footsteps died away. Bewildered and torn, the girl stood at the top of the stairs. Why had Irene gone, leaving her mistress of the field? What did it mean? Had she really given him up to her, or had she? And she was the prey of a gnawing uncertainty. Bosinney did not come. About 6 o'clock that afternoon old Jolyon returned from Wisteria Avenue, where now almost every day he spent some hours, and asked if his granddaughter were upstairs. On being told that she had just come in, he sent up to her room to request her to come down and speak to him. He had made up his mind to tell her that he was reconciled with her father. In future bygones must be bygones. He would no longer live alone, or practically alone, in this great house. He was going to give it up, and take one in the country for his son, where they could all go and live together. If June did not like this, she could have an allowance and live by herself. It wouldn't make much difference to her, for it was a long time since she had shown him any affection. But when June came down, her face was pinched and piteous. There was a strained, pathetic look in her eyes. She snuggled up in her old attitude on the arm of his chair, and what he said compared but poorly with the clear, authoritative, injured statement he had thought out with much care. His heart felt sore, as the great heart of a mother bird feels sore when its youngling flies and bruises its wing. His words halted, as though he were apologizing for having at last deviated from the path of virtue, and succumbed, in defiance of sounder principles, to his more natural instincts. He seemed nervous lest, in thus announcing his intentions, he should be setting his granddaughter a bad example. And now that he came to the point, his way of putting the suggestion that, if she didn't like it, she could live by herself and lump it, was delicate in the extreme. "And if, by any chance, my darling," he said, "you found you didn't get on with them, why, I could make that all right." You could have what you liked. We could find a little flat in London where you could set up, and I could be running to continually. But the children," he added, "are dear little things." Then, in the midst of this grave, rather transparent explanation of changed policy, his eyes twinkled. "This'll astonish Timothy's weak nerves. That precious young thing will have something to say about this, or I'm a Dutchman." June had not yet spoken. Perched thus on the arm of his chair, with her head above him, her face was invisible. But presently he felt her warm cheek against his own, and knew that, at all events, there was nothing very alarming in her attitude towards his news. He began to take courage. "You'll like your father," he said. "An amiable chap. Never was much push about him, but easy to get on with. You'll find him artistic and all that." And old Jolyon bethought him of the dozen or so water-colour drawings all carefully locked up in his bedroom, for now that his son was going to become a man of property he did not think them quite such poor things as heretofore. "As to your stepmother," he said, using the word with some little difficulty, "I call her a refined woman, a bit of a Mrs. Gummidge, I shouldn't wonder, but very fond of Joe." "And the children," he repeated. Indeed, this sentence ran like music through all his solemn self-justification, "are sweet little things." If June had known, those words but reincarnated that tender love for little children, for the young and weak, which in the past had made him desert his son for her tiny self, and now, as the cycle rolled, was taking him from her. But he began to get alarmed at her silence, and asked impatiently, "Well, what do you say?" June slid down to his knee, and she in her turn began her tale. She thought it would all go splendidly. She did not see any difficulty, and she did not care a bit what people thought. Old Jolyon wriggled. Ahem! Then people would think. He had thought that after all these years, perhaps they wouldn't. Well, he couldn't help it. Nevertheless, he could not approve of his granddaughter's way of putting it. She ought to mind what people thought. Yet he said nothing. His feelings were too mixed, too inconsistent for expression. No, went on June, he did not care. What business was it of theirs? There was only one thing, and with her cheek pressing against his knee, old Jolyon knew at once that this something was no trifle. As he was going to buy a house in the country, would he not, to please her, buy that splendid house of Soames at Robin Hill? It was finished, it was perfectly beautiful, and no one would live in it now. They would all be so happy there. Old Jolyon was on the alert at once. Wasn't the man of property going to live in his new house then? He never alluded to Soames now under this title. No, June said, he was not. She knew that he was not. How did she know? She could not tell him, but she knew. She knew nearly for certain. It was most unlikely. Circumstances had changed. Irene's words still rang in her head. "I have left Soames. Where should I go?" But she kept silence about that. If her grandfather would only buy it and settle that wretched claim that ought never to have been made on Phil, it would be the very best thing for everybody, and everything might come straight. And June put her lips to his forehead, and pressed them close. But old Jolyon freed himself from her caress. His face wore the judicial look which came upon it when he dealt with affairs. He asked, what did she mean? There was something behind all this. Had she been seeing Bosinney? June answered, "No, but I have been to his rooms." "Been to his rooms? Who took you there?" June faced him steadily. "I went alone. He has lost that case. I don't care whether it was right or wrong. I want to help him, and I will." Old Jolyon asked again, "Have you seen him?" His glance seemed to pierce right through the girl's eyes into her soul. Again June answered, "No, he was not there. I waited, but he did not come." Old Jolyon made a movement of relief. She had risen and looked down at him, so slight and light and young, but so fixed, and so determined and disturbed. Vexed as he was, he could not frown away that fixed look. The feeling of being beaten, of the reins having slipped, of being old and tired, mastered him. "Ah," he said at last, "you'll get yourself in a mess one of these days, I can see. You want your own way in everything." Visited by one of his strange bursts of philosophy, he added, "Like that you were born, and like that you'll stay until you die." And he, who in his dealings with men of business, with boards, with Forsytes of all descriptions, which such as were not Forsytes, had always had his own way, looked at his indomitable grandchild sadly, for he felt in her that quality which above all others he unconsciously admired. "Do you know what they say is going on?" he said slowly. June crimsoned. "Yes, no, I know, and I don't know. I don't care," and she stamped her foot. "I believe," said old Jolyon, dropping his eyes, "that you'd have him if he were dead." There was a long silence before he spoke again. "But as to buying this house, you don't know what you're talking about." June said that she did. She knew that he could get it if he wanted. He would only have to give what it cost. "What it cost? You know nothing about it. I won't go to Soames. I'll have nothing more to do with that young man." "But you needn't. You can go to Uncle James. If you can't buy the house, will you pay his lawsuit claim? I know he is terribly hard up. I've seen it. You can stop it out of my money." A twinkle came into old Jolyon's eyes. "Stop it out of your money? A pretty way! And what will you do, pray, without your money?" But secretly the idea of wresting the house from James and his son had begun to take hold of him. He had heard on Forsyte 'Change much comment, much rather doubtful praise of this house. It was too artistic, but a fine place. To take from the man of property that on which he had set his heart, would be a crowning triumph over James, practical proof that he was going to make a man of property of Joe, to put him back in his proper position, and there to keep him secure. Justice once for all on those who had chosen to regard his son as a poor, penniless outcast. He would see, he would see. It might be out of the question. He was not going to pay a fancy price, but if it could be done, why, perhaps he would do it. And still more secretly he knew that he could not refuse her. But he did not commit himself. He would think it over, he said to June. End of Part 3, Chapter 7.
Part 3, Chapter number 8 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick. The Forsyte Saga, The Man of Property, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 8. Bosinney's departure. Old Jolyon was not given to hasty decisions. It is probable that he would have continued to think over the purchase of the house at Robin Hill had not June's face told him that he would have no peace until he acted. At breakfast next morning she asked him what time she should order the carriage. "Carriage?" he said, with some appearance of innocence. "What for? I am not going out." She answered, "If you don't go early, you won't catch Uncle James before he goes into the city." "James? What about your Uncle James?" "The house," she replied, in such a voice that he no longer pretended ignorance. "I have not made up my mind," he said. "You must, you must! Oh, Gran, think of me!" Old Jolyon grumbled out, "Think of you? I am always thinking of you, but you don't think of yourself." "You don't think what you are letting yourself in for." "Well, order the carriage at 10. At 1/4 he was placing his umbrella in the stand at Park Lane. He did not choose to relinquish his hat and coat. Telling Warmson that he wanted to see his master, he went, without being announced, into the study and sat down. James was still in the dining room talking to Soames, who had come round again before breakfast. On hearing who his visitor was, he muttered nervously, "Now, what does he want, I wonder?" He then got up. "Well," he said to Soames, "don't you go doing anything in a hurry. The first thing is to find out where she is. I should go to Stayner's about it. They are the best men. If they can't find her, nobody can." And suddenly moved to strange softness, he muttered to himself, "Poor little thing, I can't tell what she was thinking about," and went out blowing his nose. Old Jolyon did not rise on seeing his brother, but held out his hand and exchanged with him the clasp of a Forsyte. James took another chair by the table and leaned his head on his hand. "Well," he said, "how are you? We don't see much of you nowadays." Old Jolyon paid no attention to the remark. "How is Emily?" he asked, and waiting for no reply went on, "I have come to see you about this affair of young Bosinney's. I am told that new house of his is a white elephant." "I don't know anything about a white elephant," said James. "I know he has lost his case, and I should say he will go bankrupt." Old Jolyon was not slow to seize the opportunity this gave him. "I shouldn't wonder a bit," he agreed, "and if he goes bankrupt, the man of property, that is Soames, will be out of pocket. Now, what I was thinking was this: if he is not going to live there—" Seeing both surprise and suspicion in James's eye, he quickly went on, "I don't want to know anything. I suppose Irene has put her foot down. It is not material to me. But I am thinking of a house in the country myself, not too far from London, and if it suited me, I don't say that I might not look at it at a price." James listened to this statement with a strange mixture of doubt, suspicion, and relief, merging into a dread of something behind, and tinged with the remains of his old undoubted reliance upon his elder brother's good faith and judgment. There was anxiety, too, as to what old Jolyon could have heard, and how he had heard it, and a sort of hopefulness arising from the thought that if June's connection with Bosinney were completely at an end, her grandfather would hardly seem anxious to help the young fellow. Altogether he was puzzled, as he did not like either to show this or to commit himself in any way. He said, "They tell me you are altering your will in favour of your son." He had not been told this. He had merely added the fact of having seen old Jolyon with his son and grandchildren to the fact that he had taken his will away from Forsyte, Bustard and Forsyte. The shot went home. "Who told you that?" asked old Jolyon. "I'm sure I don't know," said James. "I can't remember names. I know somebody told me Soames spent a lot of money on this house. He's not likely to part with it except at a good price." "Well," said old Jolyon, "if he thinks I'm going to pay a fancy price, he's mistaken. I've not got the money to throw away that he seems to have. Let him try and sell it at a forced sale, and see what he will get. It's not every man's house, I hear." James, who was secretly also of this opinion, answered, "It's a gentleman's house. Soames is here now, if you would like to see him." "No," said old Jolyon, "I've not got as far as that, and I'm not likely to. I can see that very well, if I am met in this manner." James was a little cowed. When it came to the actual figures of a commercial transaction he was sure of himself, for then he was dealing with facts, not with men. But preliminary negotiations such as these made him nervous. He never knew quite how far he could go. "Well," he said, "I know nothing about it. Soames, he tells me nothing. I should think he would entertain it. It's a question of price." "Oh," said old Jolyon, "don't let him make a favour of it." He placed his hat on his head in dudgeon. The door was opened and Soames came in. "There's a policeman out here," he said with his half smile, "for Uncle Jolyon." Old Jolyon looked at him angrily, and James said, "A policeman? I don't know anything about a policeman. But I suppose you know something about him," he added to old Jolyon with a look of suspicion. "I suppose you had better see him." In the hall an inspector of police stood stolidly regarding with heavy-lidded, pale blue eyes the fine old furniture picked up by James at the famous Mavrojano sale in Portman Square. "You'll find my brother in there," said James. The inspector raised his fingers respectfully to his peaked cap and entered the study. James saw him go in with a strange sensation. "Well," he said to Soames, "I suppose we must wait and see what he wants. Your uncle has been here about the house." He returned with Soames into the dining room, but could not rest. "Now what does he want?" he murmured again. "Who?" replied Soames. "The inspector? They sent him round from Stanhope Gate, that's all I know. That nonconformist of Uncle Jolyon's has been pilfering, I shouldn't wonder." But in spite of his calmness, he too was ill at ease. At the end of 10 minutes old Jolyon came in. He walked up to the table and stood there perfectly silent, pulling at his long white moustaches. James gazed up at him with opening mouth. He had never seen his brother look like this. Old Jolyon raised his hand and said slowly: "Young Bosinney has been run over in the fog and killed." Then, standing above his brother and his nephew, and looking down at him with his deep eyes, "There is some talk of suicide," he said. James's jaw dropped. "Suicide? What should he do that for?" Old Jolyon answered sternly: "God knows, if you and your son don't." But James did not reply. For all men of great age, even for all Forsytes, life has had bitter experiences. The passer-by, who sees them wrapped in cloaks of custom, wealth, and comfort, would never suspect that such black shadows had fallen on their roads. To every man of great age, to Sir Walter Bentham himself, the idea of suicide has once at least been present in the anteroom of his soul, on the threshold, waiting to enter, held out from the inmost chamber by some chance reality, some vague fear, some painful hope. To Forsytes, that final renunciation of property is hard. Oh, it is hard. Seldom, perhaps never, can they achieve it, and yet how near have they not sometimes been? So even with James. Then in the medley of his thoughts he broke out: "Why, I saw it in the paper yesterday. Run over in the fog." They did not know his name. He turned from one face to the other in his confusion of soul. But instinctively, all the time, he was rejecting that rumor of suicide. He dared not entertain this thought, so against his interest, against the interest of his son, of every Forsyte. He strove against it, and as his nature ever unconsciously rejected that which it could not with safety accept, so gradually he overcame this fear. It was an accident. It must have been. Old Jolyon broke in on his reverie. Death was instantaneous. He lay all day yesterday at the hospital. There was nothing to tell them who he was. "I am going there now, and you and your son had better come too." No one opposing this command, he led the way from the room. The day was still and clear and bright, and driving over to Park Lane from Stanhope Gate, Old Jolyon had had the carriage open. Sitting back on the padded cushions, finishing his cigar, he had noticed with pleasure the keen crispness of the air, the bustle of the cabs and people, the strange, almost Parisian alacrity that the first fine day will bring into London streets after a spell of fog or rain. And he felt so happy. He had not felt like it for months. His confession to June was off his mind. He had the prospect of his son's, above all of his grandchildren's company in the future. He had appointed to meet young Jolyon at the Hotch-Potch that very morning, to discuss it again, and there was the pleasurable excitement of a coming encounter, a coming victory over James and the man of property in the matter of the house. He had the carriage closed now. He had no heart to look on Gaiety, nor was it right that Forsytes should be seen driving with an inspector of police. In that carriage the inspector spoke again of the death. It was not so very thick just there. The driver says the gentleman must have had time to see what he was about. He seemed to walk right into it. It appears that he was very hard up. We found several pawn tickets at his rooms. His account at the bank is overdrawn, and there is this case in today's papers. His cold blue eyes travelled from one to another of the three Forsytes in the carriage. Old Jolyon, watching from his corner, saw his brother's face change and the brooding, worried look deepen on it. At the inspector's words, indeed, old James's doubts and fears revived. Hard up, pawn tickets, an overdrawn account. These words that had all his life been a far-off nightmare to him seemed to make uncannily real that suspicion of suicide which must on no account be entertained. He sought his son's eyes, but lynx-eyed, taciturn, immovable, Soames gave no answering look. And to old Jolyon, watching, divining the league of mutual defence between them, there came an overmastering desire to have his own son at his side, as though this visit to the dead man's body was a battle in which otherwise he must single-handed meet those two. And the thought of how to keep June's name out of the business kept whirring in his brain. James had his son to support him. Why should he not send for Jo? Taking out his card case, he penciled the following message: "Come round at once. I have sent the carriage for you." On getting out, he gave this card to his coachman, telling him to drive as fast as possible to the Hodgepodge Club, and if Mr. Jolyon Forsyte were there, to give him the card and bring him at once. If not there yet, he was to wait till he came. He followed the other slowly up the steps, leaning on his umbrella, and stood a moment to get his breath. The inspector said, "This is the mortuary, sir, but take your time." In the bare, white-walled room, empty of all but a streak of sunshine smeared along the dustless floor, lay a form covered by a sheet. With a huge steady hand the inspector took the ham and turned it back. A sightless face gazed up at them, and on either side of that sightless, defiant face the three Forsytes gazed down. In each one of them the secret emotions, fears and pity of his own nature rose and fell like the rising, falling waves of life, whose wish those white walls barred out now for ever from Bosinney. And in each one of them the trend of his nature, the odd essential spring, which moved him in fashions minutely, unalterably different from those of every other human being, forced him to a different attitude of thought. Far from the others, yet inscrutably close, each stood thus, alone with death, silent, his eyes lowered. The inspector asked softly, "You identified the gentleman, sir?" Old Jolyon raised his head and nodded. He looked at his brother opposite, at that long, lean figure brooding over the dead man, with face dusky red and strained grey eyes, and at the figure of Soames, white and still by his father's side. And all that he had felt against those two was gone like smoke in the long, white presence of death. Whence comes it? How comes it? Death. Sudden reverse of all that goes before, blind setting forth on a path that leads to where? Dark quenching of the fire, the heavy, brutal crushing out that all men must go through, keeping their eyes clear and brave on to the end. Small and of no import, insects though they are, and across old Jolyon's face there flitted a gleam, for Soames, murmuring to the inspector, crept noiselessly away. Then suddenly James raised his eyes. There was a queer appeal in that suspicious, troubled look. "I know I'm no match for you," it seemed to say. And hunting for handkerchief, he wiped his brow. Then, bending sorrowful and lank over the dead man, he too turned and hurried out. Old Jolyon stood still as death, his eyes fixed on the body. Who shall tell of what he was thinking? Of himself, when his hair was brown like the hair of that young fellow dead before him? Of himself, with his battle just beginning, the long, long battle he had loved, the battle that was over for this young man almost before it had begun. Of his granddaughter, with her broken hopes, of that other woman, of the strangeness and the pity of it, and the irony inscrutable and bitter of that end, justice. There was no justice for man, for they were ever in the dark. Or perhaps in his philosophy he thought, better to be out of it all. Better to have done with it, like this poor youth. Someone touched him on the arm. A tear started up and wetted his eyelash. "Well," he said, "I am no good here. I had better be going. You'll come to me as soon as you can, Jo," and with his head bowed he went away. It was young Jolyon's turn to take his stand beside the dead man, round whose fallen body he seemed to see all the Forsytes, breathless and prostrated. The stroke had fallen too swiftly. The forces underlying every tragedy, forces that take no denial, working through cross-currents to their ironical end, had met and fused with a thunderclap, flung out the victim, and flattened to the ground all those that stood around. Or so, at all events, young Jolyon seemed to see them, lying around Bosinney's body. He asked the inspector to tell him what had happened, and the latter, like a man who does not every day get such a chance, again detailed such facts as were known. "There is more here, sir, however," he said, "than meets the eye. I don't believe in suicide, nor in pure accident myself. It is more likely, I think, that he was suffering under great stress of mind and took no notice of things about him. Perhaps you can throw some light on these." He took from his pocket a little packet and laid it on the table. Carefully undoing it, he revealed a lady's handkerchief, pinned through the folds with a pin of discoloured Venetian gold, the stone of which had fallen from the socket. A scent of dried violets rose to young Jolyon's nostrils. "Found in his breast pocket," said the inspector. "The name has been cut away." Young Jolyon with difficulty answered, "I'm afraid I cannot help you." But vividly there rose before him the face he had seen light up, so tremulous and glad, at Bosinney's coming. Of her he thought more than of his own daughter, more than of them all. Of her with the dark, soft glance, the delicate, passive face, waiting for the dead man, waiting even at that moment, perhaps, still and patient in the sunlight. He walked sorrowfully away from the hospital towards his father's house, reflecting that this death would break up the Forsyte family. The stroke had indeed slipped past their defences into the very wood of their tree. They might flourish to all appearance as before, preserving a brave show before the eyes of London, but the trunk was dead, withered by the same flash that had stricken down Bosinney. And now the saplings would take its place, each one a new custodian of the sense of property. "Good forest of Forsytes," thought young Jolyon, "soundest timber of our land." Concerning the cause of this death, his family would doubtless reject with vigour the suspicion of suicide which was so compromising. They would take it as an accident, a stroke of fate. In their hearts they would even feel it an intervention of Providence, a retribution. Had not Bosinney endangered their two most priceless possessions, the pocket and the hearse? And they would talk of that unfortunate accident of young Bosinney's. But perhaps they would not talk. Silence might be better. As for himself, he regarded the bus driver's account of the accident as of very little value, for no one so madly in love committed suicide for want of money, nor was Bosinney the sort of fellow to set much store by a financial crisis. And so he too rejected this theory of suicide. The dead man's face rose too clearly before him, gone in the heyday of his summer, and to believe thus that an accident had cut Bosinney off in the full sweep of his passion was more than ever pitiful to young Jolyon. Then came a vision of Soames's home as it now was, and must be hereafter. The streak of lightning had flashed its clear, uncanny gleam on bare bones with grinning spaces between. The disguising flash was gone. In the dining room at Stanhope Gate, old Jolyon was sitting alone when his son came in. He looked very wan in his great armchair, and his eyes travelling round the walls with the pictures of still life and the masterpiece Dutch fishing boats at sunset seemed as though passing their gaze over his life, with its hopes, its gains, its achievements. "Ah, Jo," he said, "is that you? I have told poor little June. But that is not all of it. Are you going to Soames's? She has brought it on herself, I suppose, but somehow I can't bear to think of her, shut up there and all alone." And holding up his thin, veined hand, he clenched it. End of Part 3, Chapter 8. Bosinney's Departure. Recording by Eva Harnick. Part 3, Chapter 9 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick. The Forsyte Saga, The Man of Property, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 9, Irene's Return. After leaving James and old Jolyon in the mortuary at the hospital, Soames hurried aimlessly along the streets. The tragic event of Bosinney's death altered the complexion of everything. There was no longer the same feeling that to lose a minute would be fatal, nor would he now risk communicating the fact of his wife's flight to anyone till the inquest was over. That morning he had risen early, before the postman came, had taken the first post letters from the box himself, and though there had been none from Irene, he had made an opportunity of telling Bilson that her mistress was at sea. He would probably, he said, be going down himself from Saturday to Monday. This had given him time to breathe, time to leave no stone unturned to find her. But now, cut off from taking steps by Bosinney's death, that strange death, to think of which was like putting a hot iron to his heart, like lifting a great weight from it. He did not know how to pass his day, and he wandered here and there through the streets, looking at every face he met, devoured by 100 anxieties. And as he wandered, he thought of him who had finished his wandering, his prowling, and would never haunt his house again. Already in the afternoon he passed posters announcing the identity of the dead man, and bought the papers to see what they said. He would stop their mouths if he could. and he went into the city and was closeted with Bolter for a long time. On his way home, passing the steps of Jobson's about 4:30, he met George Forsyte, who held out an evening paper to Soames, saying, "Here, have you seen this about the poor buccaneer?" Soames answered stonily, "Yes." George stared at him. He had never liked Soames. He now held him responsible for Bosinney's death. Soames had done for him by that act of property that had sent the buccaneer to run amok that fatal afternoon. The poor fellow, he was thinking, was so cracked with jealousy, so cracked for his vengeance, that he heard nothing of the omnibus in that infernal fog. Soames had done for him, and this judgment was in George's eyes. "They talk of suicide here," he said at last. "That cat won't jump." Soames shook his head. "An accident," he muttered. Clenching his fist on the paper, George crammed it into his pocket. He could not resist a parting shot. "Hum! All flourishing at home? Any little Soameses yet?" With a face as white as the steps of Jobson's, and the lip raised as if snarling, Soames brushed past him and was gone. On reaching home and entering the little lighted hall with his latchkey, the first thing that caught his eye was his wife's gold-mounted umbrella lying on the rug chest. Flinging off his fur coat, he hurried to the drawing-room. The curtains were drawn for the night. A bright fire of cedar logs burned in the grate, and by its light he saw Irene sitting in her usual corner on the sofa. He shut the door softly and went towards her. She did not move, and did not seem to see him. "So you have come back," he said. "Why are you sitting here in the dark?" Then he caught sight of her face, so white and motionless that it seemed as though the blood must have stopped flowing in her veins, and her eyes that looked enormous, like the great, wide, startled brown eyes of an owl. Huddled in her grey fur against the sofa cushions, she had a strange resemblance to a captive owl, bunched fur, its soft feathers against the wires of a cage. The supple erectness of her figure was gone, as though she had been broken by cruel exercise, as though there were no longer any reason for being beautiful and supple and erect. "So you have come back," he repeated. She never looked up and never spoke, the firelight playing over her motionless figure. Suddenly she tried to rise, but he prevented her. It was then that he understood. She had come back like an animal wounded to death, not knowing where to turn, not knowing what she was doing. The sight of her figure huddled in the fur was enough. He knew then for certain that Bosinney had been her lover, knew that she had seen the report of his death, perhaps, like himself, had bought a paper at the draughty corner of a street and read it. She had come back then of her own accord to the cage she had pined to be free of, and taking in all the tremendous significance of this, he longed to cry, "Take your hated body, that I love, out of my house. Take away that pitiful white face, so cruel and soft, before I crush it. Get out of my sight. Never let me see you again." And at those unspoken words he seemed to see her rise and move away like a woman in a terrible dream from which she was fighting to awake, rise and go out into the dark and cold, without a thought of him, without so much as the knowledge of his presence. Then he cried, contradicting what he had not yet spoken, "No, stay there!" And turning away from her, he sat down in his accustomed chair on the other side of the hearth. They sat in silence, and Soames thought, "Why is all this? Why should I suffer so? What have I done? It is not my fault." Again he looked at her, huddled like a bird that is shot and dying, whose poor breast you see panting as the air is taken from it, whose poor eyes look at you who have shot it, with a slow, soft, unseeing look, taking farewell of all that is good, of the sun and the air and its mate. So they sat by the firelight in the silence, one on each side of the hearth. And the fume of the burning cedar logs that he loved so well seemed to grip Soames by the throat till he could bear it no longer. And going out into the hall, he flung the door wide to gulp down the cold air that came in, then without hat or overcoat went out into the square. Along the garden rails a half-starved cat came rubbing her way towards him, and Soames thought, "Suffering! When will it cease, my suffering?" At the front door across the way was a man of his acquaintance named Rutter, scraping his boots with an air of "I'm master here," and Soames walked on. From far in the clear air the bells of the church where he and Irene had been married were pealing in practice for the advent of Christ, the chimes ringing out above the sound of traffic. He felt a craving for strong drink to lull him to indifference or rouse him to fury. If only he could burst out of himself, out of this web that for the first time in his life he felt around him. If only he could surrender to the thought, "Divorce her, turn her out. She has forgotten you. Forget her." If only he could surrender to the thought, "Let her go. She has suffered enough." If only he could surrender to the desire, "Make a slave of her. She is in your power." If only even he could surrender to the sudden vision, "What does it all matter?" Forget himself for a minute, forget that it mattered what he did, forget whatever he did, he must sacrifice something. If only he could act on an impulse. He could forget nothing, surrender no thought, vision or desire. It was all too serious, too close around him, an unbreakable cage. On the far side of the square, newspaper boys were calling their evening wares, and the ghoulish cries mingled and jangled with the sound of those church bells. Soames covered his ears. The thought flashed across him that but for a chance he himself and not Bosinney might be lying dead, and she, instead of crouching there like a shot bird with those dying eyes. Something soft touched his legs. The cat was rubbing herself against them, and a sob that shook him from head to foot burst from Soames's chest. Then all was still again in the dark, where the houses seemed to stare at him, each with a master and mistress of its own, and a secret story of happiness or sorrow. And suddenly he saw that his own door was open, and black against the light from the hall, a man standing with his back turned. Something slid to in his breast, and he stole up close behind. He could see his own fur coat flung across the carved oak chair, the Persian rugs, the silver bowls, the rows of porcelain plates arranged along the walls, and this unknown man who was standing there. And sharply he asked, "What is it you want, sir?" The visitor turned. It was young Jolyon. "The door was open," he said. "Might I see your wife for a minute? I have a message for her." Soames gave him a strange, sidelong stare. "My wife can see no one," he muttered doggedly. Young Jolyon answered gently, "I shouldn't keep her a minute." Soames brushed by him and barred the way. "She can see no one," he said again. Young Jolyon's glance shot past him into the hall, and Soames turned. There, in the drawing-room doorway, stood Irene. Her eyes were wild and eager, her lips were parted, her hands outstretched. In the sight of both men that light vanished from her face. Her hands dropped to her sides. She stood like stone. Soames spun around and met his visitor's eyes, and at the look he saw in them a sound like a snarl escaped him. He drew his lips back in the ghost of a smile. "This is my house," he said. "I manage my own affairs. I have told you once, I tell you again, we are not at home." And in young Jolyon's face he slammed the door. End of Part 3, Chapter 9. Irene's Return. End of The Man of Property by John Galsworthy. Recording by Eva Harnick.